Right, delighted to be back here with Pippa Bagnall. Pippa, we were just chatting a little bit about you, your background and leadership, really this thing about leadership and leadership from the heart. You're featured in this book where, thank you very much for your comments on that, because I think that we're at quite a pivotal time in terms of leadership. You're heading off to Australia for a huge challenge, working alongside the government, with the government to develop health policy and then to deliver it. What's your reflections in terms of leadership and so on in the UK? Because we were just talking before we paused about this is an interesting moment. You drew to my attention the other day, the 1st of April this particular year, 2013, there's big changes. Tell us a little bit about that and your thoughts about leadership generally.
I think the challenge for leadership in this country is that politically we're encouraged to make change very quickly.
Right.
And
what do you mean by that? You mean, is it because of the political structure that we're looking for these changes and to do this and to come up with an idea of moving things forward? Is it that?
Well, I don't want to speak for the whole country or for every industry, but I think my experience with the National Health Service is that on April the 1st we've got a whole new organisational structure with people who have not been in these leadership responsible positions before, and I'm thrilled that GPs are taking the lead, and that we can make clinical decisions closer to the business of the NHS. I'm very pro that. But you can't just take on leadership overnight.
Right.
You need to prepare for it. You need to know what kind of a leader you are. You need to know what you're leading. And if you've got a whole new structure and people are new into posts and the people that have been there for a long time have gone, it's just like trying to sort of switch on a light and make everything work.
Yeah. And this is interesting. From just hearing what you're saying, I know the times when I've coached people who have been leaders. I remember once coaching somebody who was starting a particular role, and he was very mindful that he really wanted to take that time, going into a new charity, lovely person with a real warm heart. He really wanted to take that time to find out what kind of a leader he was. He knew he wanted a more collaborative kind of style of leadership and to affect change, and he really. That's what we're working on, and I would imagine that's really important, isn't it? Because I guess it must be so daunting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm developing my 100-day plan for my arrival in Australia. You know, what am I going to do in my first 100 days? If I go in and think I can change everything and I'll be a success, then that would be really bad news.
Yes.
I need to know who I'm working with.
Yeah.
I need to understand the system. I need to get to know people and to build relationships with people. Because if I'm going to do something which requires change, an awful lot of people find change very threatening. And I think the best thing to do is to get people to own change. And the only way you can do that is by hearing their agendas, hearing about what the problems are, what the difficulties are. You cannot impose a blueprint on people. You've got, because it's people that make change happen.
Yes. And I'm interested, now that you're talking a bit about change and leadership, you've got an interesting perspective. You've spent some time in a political context within it. Can you tell us a little bit about if you can tell us, if you can tell me without kidding me, when you were the cabinet, what's that, about helping develop health strategy? I'm mindful, because I know you've also worked within charity settings, so I'm keen to get a bit of a flavour of these different environments.
I was Principal Advisor on Health in the Prime Minister's Office of Public Service Reform. So I had a...
Which administration?
Under Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Under the Labour Party, and I had a huge opportunity to shape policy, to influence people, and to take people on a journey of all political parties, to be perfectly honest, about how do you deliver the best healthcare in the country. And it was a very exciting position to be in. I suppose my reservation was that I was a civil servant. I was accountable to ministers, and the ministerial agenda, the political agenda, is driven by the 5-year period of being in office. And it concerns me that we look at short-term gains rather than long-term achievements.
Yeah, and I guess that's a real
improvement.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that that's a real challenge that affects many different areas, isn't it? That we do tend to look very often for a short period of time, and I guess no more obviously so than in the political kind of context. So I can imagine that there's a tension there, that you're somebody who, I know from meeting you in some of the environments that you've worked in, you're genuinely passionate about how is it that we actually help people. I mean, that's one of the things that comes through. You know, I remember the work with you at Health Check, you're really mindful about how is it we're able to help the user, how is it maybe to help the member of the public actually, let's say somebody who's homeless, actually take more charge of their well-being, to give them the support that they need, to help them become resourceful, and so on. And then I guess that there's a big difference between that area and then when you're thrown into a different environment.
I think it's been very useful that I've had a balance of both. So throughout my career, even as a senior civil servant, I've been working with homeless people in a charity or with individuals. And later on today I shall be meeting with one of them that I've been helping, who's now training to be a nurse. And I'm thrilled. So I think there's something about a reality check as a leader that I think sometimes in politics you can lose sight of what's really happening. That's why I'm so concerned about the welfare reform that's been thrown at the country, as well as big changes in the NHS all at the same time. That I really am concerned that the people we have a welfare system for are going to suffer.
Right, and so there's a number of things you're pointing out there here. There's the issue of leadership and leaders and how you prepare people who are leading. You talked about, for example, the health context, and do you actually support those people and making the timing of those changes right? And then are we mindful enough and engaging the people who it is that whatever change is actually for? What's your experience about that? About how do you? Because I guess when as you're a leader, you've got all these different kind of challenges. You've got to, there's whoever's put you in that leadership position, there's an agenda that you've got to deliver. You've got to have your own sense of who you are as a leader. And then there are these different, perhaps constituencies that you're trying to address. What's your observations in terms of, for a leader, what is it those key things that you need to do? Because you talk, for example, about your first 100 days in this new role. What's the key things that a leader needs to be mindful of?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I think the key thing is to understand who you're working with and who you're working for. And it may seem obvious at the outset that you think you know what you're going into, but you've got to take time to understand the complexities of the environment within which you're working. And I think the problem with leadership at the moment is that leaders tend to have different personal goals and not always in the best interests of the people we're trying to serve. And I think that people can lose sight of the prime purpose of leadership. And in any organisation that I will work in, I will make sure that we're all learning all the time and that we're reflecting and checking that we're absolutely getting it right. Because things like healthcare and healthcare delivery and healthcare systems, no one person, everyone has a different sort of requirement. There is not a single way of dealing with it. So how do you create environments where we value people, where we care about them, where we don't disadvantage them? And so many of the homeless people that I work with are hugely disadvantaged by the system. I am trying so hard to get a 37-year-old Englishman into accommodation, but because his needs are low, he's just not being supported. I
remember once, and I wonder if it's okay to talk about this now, you once mentioned to me a particular initiative that you were at that point looking at. For example, you were just exploring a number of things, and one of the things that you were exploring was that, for example, if you take, for example, the homelessness context, could you take some people who are homeless, give them things like mobile phones that might have certain information and so on, so that will be able to help them to be able to spot places where there might be support for them to call and so on, that will make them, instead of being dependent often, to hopefully becoming, over a period of time, independent and supported, and then becoming independent. Stuff like that. I remember when you mentioned that, thinking, actually, that's such a sensible idea. Do you think that we actually generally often have the stomach to actually genuinely help people, and to do we really care enough? It was interesting, I love the bit where you talk about people and different goals. Do you think often we care enough to actually genuinely work collaboratively and really genuinely help people in a way that's helpful for them, whether it's staff or whether it is, there's somebody on the street, or in whatever context, it could be in business, whatever. Because my own particular feeling is that very often we get so caught up in all of the noise around leadership and the environment and career progression and this and that, that we actually meet people transactionally as opposed to transformationally. That's my take, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted your contribution to the book. What's your first-hand experience? Do you think we actually care enough?
I think that society has quite a negative take on people who are struggling.
Mm.
I think that this whole welfare reform is about saying that people have learnt to become dependent on it. Well, why? Because we've let them. Mm. And there are an awful lot of people that I've worked with that hate being in the, sort of being dependent. Mm. And they want opportunities. And I don't think we give people enough opportunities and enough belief that they can do something. And there's a sort of phrase which I use, which is, they might be homeless, but they're not hopeless. Mm. You or I could be homeless, and we would want to get ourselves sorted out, but you need people around you to do that. And I think that's where I get frustrated, that we allow systems to be led in a way that are not necessarily kind to the most needy. And I can use the NHS, I know how to get to my GP practice, I know how to book an appointment online. But if we could really put our strong belief in those who are most struggling in society, rather than the middle class sort of will help you take over, I think we could have the most extraordinary healthcare and welfare system in the world.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying, because I also get a sense from what you're saying that if you genuinely look more deeply at this thing, you're able to actually genuinely empower people.
Yeah.
And then the impact of what that empowering might be, we might not even have an idea about it because we haven't done it really for so long.
Yeah.
What happened, and I know that you've seen this in some of the environments where you've worked on certain programs, for example, a particular organisation where you met, where you were looking at particular programs that might take people who are homeless to give them life skills, all sorts of support, education, all sorts of things that those people can develop vocational skills, all things that we talk about and we know, but then when somebody actually has that, they become independent. I can remember one person in one of those particular settings, somebody who's, like many people, of course, very, very able. Give them a little bit of support and so on, absolutely shines, getting their career, independent living and so on. And these are the kind of things that I know it is that you're really passionate about, and that can actually happen if we're prepared to look more deeply. I'm wondering if I'm going to pause the camera again and maybe come back last time to talk a little bit about, pick up some of these themes, tips for leaders. I mean, we've already talked about a little bit about this, and I think that there's many people who, for example, I meet, some of them who are, there are some of them who could be leaders, and maybe a little bit shy.
Yes.
You get other people who are leaders, and actually how do they allow themselves to actually lead from the heart? And perhaps other people are just watching this and curious about leadership generally, and to talk about some of those particular themes. And you also talked about something a while ago, I think I'm very keen for us to talk about, which is knowing your own core as a leader, because there's going to be all these different kind of challenges, because we're ultimately about how is it that one actually affects change. Okay, so I'm going to come back and let's
great.
talk about that.
Sounds excellent. I'll give it some thought.
Thank you.